Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the modern papacy with the next installment in the reign of Pope Pius VI. During his reign, both the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution took place. The American Revolution will go into much more detail in the fourth year course for the seminarians, and in the previous session on Pius VI, we covered the lead up, the context of the long term, the remote background of the French Revolution. So now we pick up with the proximate and the actual event of the French Revolution. So the proximate sequence of events culminating in the French Revolution introduces us to yet another churchman without a vocation, produced by the feudalism problem. This is Cardinal Etienne Charles de, that's D-E, Lomenie, L-O-M-E-N-I-E, de, again, another D-E, Brienne, B-R-I-E-N-N-E. He served as French Minister of Finance from the 17th of May, 1787, to the 25th of August, 1788. Born in Paris on the 9th of October, 1727, he was a younger son of the Count of Brienne, whose aristocratic seat was in the city of Limoges in the Limousin region. The Limousin region of France. Yes, that is where the term limousine comes from. He was sent into the church by his family without any interest in ecclesiastical life, in his case, without even rudimentary faith. Brienne was as much of an Enlightenment rationalist as his friend Voltaire. He earned a doctorate in theology. He graduated at the bottom of his, the last one in his class, but he did just what he had to do to get the credential in 1751, and was immediately appointed Vicar General to the Cardinal Archbishop of Rouen, who was a relative, obviously, of his family. Well, they're not the same family, but his family were related by marriage to Brienne's family. He became Bishop of Condom in 1760, Archbishop of Toulouse in 1763, and collected more benefice income from appointment as Abbot of Mont Saint-Michel and Abbot of the Abbey of Corbière. He was appointed Finance Minister on the 17th of May, 1787, and he inherited the catastrophic financial situation described in the previous session, so I won't repeat that. Revenue from tax theft was steadily falling as the economy contracted. His solution, which was blamed on the church, since he was a churchman, he was a cardinal archbishop, was first to introduce another tax, stamp tax, imitated from the British application of that in North America. Second, an additional land tax on top of all the other land taxes that I summarized last time. This new one was on the value of the land, and of course the value was computed by his office. And third, which is the one that really was one of the proximate triggers for what happened after, and why it became so violent and so visceral, was his third idea was nationalizing the feudal corvée system. All right, that's spelled Corvee. The corvée was one of the vestiges of the Roman Empire that survived and was integrated into feudalism. The empire, of course, was not a free society. It was a military dictatorship. One manifestation of this unfreedom was the Opera Publica, literally public works. Imperial law required even citizens to submit to providing unpaid mandatory labor for projects deemed useful for the state. Building temples, theaters, porticos, fora, walls of towns, aqueducts, harbors, bridges, even baths and circuses, fountains, markets, roads. Now, the wealthy, anyone who had the money, could fulfill this requirement, the Opera Publica, by paying a fee. So it was another form of tax theft. But those who could not afford to buy their way out of it had to appear, and they had to work without pay. Refusal was a crime. In the empire, there were two forms of the Opera Publica. First, the Opera Officialis, which means duty work. That was unpaid forced labor for the government, such as building roads or bridges. The second category of public works, the Opera Publica, was the Opera Corrugata, Corrogata, which is derived from the Latin verb in the infinitive form, corrogare, means to requisition. So this was requisition work, which was unpaid forced labor required by private landlords from their tenants. The second form, the corrugata, is the form that endured into feudalism and into the medieval period as a lifelong demand on serfs. So the Latin word corrugare, to requisition, evolved in Gaul, which was a province of the empire that became France, into corroate, then corvii, and finally corvée. So back to Cardinal Brienne. Part of his solution to the collapsing French economy was to revive the first form, the Opera Officialis, the duty work imposed on the entire population. Except, of course, it was imposed on the entire population without exception, but those with money could pay a fee in lieu of that. So, yet another form of tax theft. So recall that an earlier Controller General of Finance, Turgot, attempted to implement free trade practices as substitute for a government monopoly on grain and bread. It failed and triggered riots because he had not also applied this free trade and free market to the transportation sector. So without pay, without a salary, without payment, the wagoneers and the bargemen didn't show up to transport the grain and to make the bread. So that's why Turgot's attempt collapsed. We covered that last time. In May of 1787, Brienne, I have a solution. He decided to simply require them to work without pay by making public work a legal requirement. The corvée, and making refusal a crime. Now, it's astonishing to me that the revolution did not happen in that instant. It's a tribute to the patience and the endurance of the French people. That if you review what we covered last time and this, it's amazing it took that the revolution waited as long as it did. Instead of an open revolution right then, he was confronted with passive resistance. The men in those trades simply just didn't show up for work, and some of them actually dismantled or broke their own wagons and barges so that they could not be stolen by the government for someone else to use. Non-compliance with unjust law is a crime in dictatorships. punished with government violence, inflicted by whatever law enforcement apparatus exists or the military. So Brienne's okay if they don't show up to work, then I'll send the police and the military to go make them come to work. Well, upon commanding the units to enforce the obedience, Cardinal Brienne discovered a case study in etiology, causation, cause and effect. The police and military had not been paid either because the economy was in complete collapse and no money existed to pay them. So the cardinal was shocked to discover that unpaid men would not force other unpaid men to work for a government that was not paying anyone. Cause and effect. So this non-compliance spread to the rest of the regular tax theft collection, as most of the population simply didn't have money to pay, or if they did, they preferred to hoard it rather than give it to a clearly disintegrating royal government. The next month, June 7th, a year later. This goes on for a year. And again, it's astonishing it lasted that long. But the economy of France relapsed, essentially into barter, local bartering. But official government function just, collapsed. I mean, there were individuals who would show up to work, just to have something to do. But they weren't paid in legal tender, so they also had to, they had to do something, some form of trade or barter to survive. So this brings us to June 7th, 1788, the Day of the Tiles, like roofing tiles, in Grenoble, Grenoble, which is in the Alpine region of France, southeastern France. This, June 7th, 1788, was the first open violence against the monarchy in the French Revolution. At 10 a.m. on that day, it was a Saturday, shops and businesses in Grenoble closed in non-compliance to tax theft and the corvée. And they formed a group of about 400 who were armed with stones, sticks, axes, bars. They attempted to seize control of the city gate and the St. Lawrence Bridge across the Isère River, and the hotel in the city where the Duke of Clermont, the local feudal lord, where he happened to be staying. He wasn't on his estate. He happened to be. That's why I was. That's what triggered this. He, instead of being on his estate, he was there in the town, and he was, a hated symbol of the injustices of feudalism and aristocracy. The Duke wisely traveled with his own contingent of armed men, whom he paid himself. Fighting ensued as the crowd tried to kidnap the Duke. Probably, who knows what they were going to do. Lynch him, hold him for ransom, whatever. I mean, mobs are not long-term thinkers. They were just operating on emotion. So they tried to capture him as well as the city magistrates, with the Duke's men fighting back. Civilians climbed on the rooftops to hurl down tiles at them, hence the Day of the Tiles. Now, this event is not as famous as the storming of the Bastille, because the leaders escaped and the total body count was less. Yet this conflict was chronologically the first blood spilled in the French Revolution. August 8th, 1788, Cardinal Brienne, in his capacity as finance minister, informed the king, Louis XVI, that the treasury was empty. And this time, this was not a figure of speech, that it literally was empty. The French economy now officially relapsed into de facto barter mode. The king agreed to the recommendation of Cardinal Brienne and others to summon the Estates General to completely rework redo to save the economy, to come up with something to save the economy, and therefore the society. The king agreed that it would open on the 5th of May, 1789, to examine ways out of the crisis. It had not met, the Estates General in France had not met since 1614, 175 years. Now, what is the Estates General? Some would describe it as the French analog to the British Parliament. There's some basis for that, but not really. The British Parliament by this point certainly was more solidified. The model Parliament in England was in 1300 and consisted of two houses. It was bicameral, well, still is bicameral legislature, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The Estates General, on the other hand, what it has in common is that it was a form of legislature. The Estates General did pass laws that were approved by the king, but it was tricameral, had three houses instead of Lords and Commons. The first house of the nation was the clergy. The second house were the Lords, the nobility, and the third house were the Commons. But that's the first estate, like state and life, clergy, nobility, commoner. So the first state or the first house, second and third. So the third estate, the third house, were the Commons, analogous to the British Commons. But that analogy can't be pushed too far because the elections and the voting was completely different than the British system. And also the power was different. By this period, the Commons in England had already taken control of the finance policy, from the monarchs, as well as foreign policy. I mean, they essentially, the Commons essentially ran the government. Not to the complete extent they do today, because the Lords in the 18th century, the House of Lords and the King did still have governing power that they do not have now. But the French system, they never did up to this point get the kind of power, real power, that the English Parliament had. But it's still a useful conceptual model. On August 16th, 1788, so on August 8th, Brienne informed the king privately the treasury was empty. On August 16th, the treasury suspended payments on all debts, domestic and foreign. So those who held government bonds, that's a domestic debt. Even though they're citizens, they're Frenchmen. They could not. The interest was not paid on those bonds, and they could not cash them in. And of course, foreign debts were repudiated. But we've seen that one happen before. So the economic collapse in France made some form of change unavoidable. On the 25th of August, 1788, Cardinal Brienne resigned. As in the period, so he thought he would prepare, he would be one of the ones preparing for the Estates General and come up with a formula, a program for them to approve. But as it happened in the planning process, it became clear that there were too many who refused to cooperate with him in planning for the forthcoming Estates General, owing to the animosity toward him personally because of his policies, especially the mandatory unpaid labor. You just think, what? Oh, well. Now, for our purposes, no one forgot that a churchman had attempted to force national labor without pay, and that the treasury was depleted, and the debt and bond obligations ceased being honored under his administration. Naturally, the church was blamed for this, since he was a churchman. Even though the church had zero, had absolutely nothing to do with this. But, the church gets blamed. And as we'll see, the church is going to suffer for this during the Revolution. So Cardinal Brienne was one personality type produced by the feudalism problem. Another type was the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Saillet. So that's the Abbé is a title, A-B-B-E. Emmanuel Joseph, you know. Now the surname Saillet, S-I-E-Y-E-S. I've also heard it pronounced Sayus, but Saillet, whatever. Lived from 1748 to 1836. He was born into the professional class in France rather than the aristocracy like Brienne. Saillet's family decided that he would pursue an ecclesiastical career. So again, feudalism problem. For which purpose he was sent to the seminary at Saint-Sulpice in Paris. And while there, he took, he went through the whole, so by the time he got to what we would think of as the university level, he took advanced courses at the Sorbonne. If he had any faith before this education, he certainly had none after a dozen years of imbibing Enlightenment, rationalist mockery of Catholicism in the university. Dismissing the faith as superstition and regarding the clergy as corrupt, he nevertheless accepted ordination to the priesthood in 1772. And he used friends from the university, his fellow students, who were better connected than him, to obtain a benefice for him to parasite from. While not, I say parasite because he was not fulfilling the duty, the cura amorum, the care of souls. And hence the title abbé. So he was actually an abbot of a monastery in Brittany, France. But of course he never, there's no evidence he even physically walked on the grounds, but he certainly never, even pretended to fulfill the obligations. And I mean, that's the feudalism problem. So when it came down to it, as we will see, when the revolution, when they turned on the church and they started attacking the church, stealing church property, that's why so many, just didn't. It was the same like the Protestant movement. Why so many abandoned the church? Because they weren't getting any. I mean, they just had to pay the tithe, which in France under the old order, the church was established, so people had to pay taxes as part, to pay the tithes to support the church. Yet they weren't getting any. They weren't getting the service. They weren't getting sacramental service. Anyway, so he did this. He parasited off the benefice, parasite off the church, just as he had obtained a free education as a leech off the church. Yet he despised the church. And so, like many of the early Protestant leaders, like Luther and Zwingli, he became another priest who hates the priesthood, a Catholic who hated Catholicism. Freed from the practical necessity of earning a living, and free to neglect his obligations to his benefice by the pervasive feudalism problem. I mean, it shows that nobody actually expected him to fulfill it because that just wasn't done. I mean, that's how things had deteriorated. So Saillet became interested in politics, which is, how he enters our story. That's why I'm not just talking about it, to beat up on him, even though he was a scumbag. But he does actually have a key role in the story. He began publishing articles and pamphlets criticizing the corrupt system by which the aristocracy advanced in the church hierarchy without fulfilling their duty. Oh, how horrible they are. But apparently, it's corrupt when aristocrats do it, but apparently it was not corrupt when he did it because he was not an aristocrat. So when these pamphlets were well received by like-minded Catholics who hated Catholicism, he expanded his critique to attack the entrenched privileges of aristocracy, hereditary aristocracy, and monarchy, which correlatively, that system excluded those born with true talent, like himself, from the highest positions in the land. The significance of this is that when the Estates General were summoned to meet for the first time in 175 years, Saillet already had an established readership primed to receive his next complaint, which was published on January 1st, 1789. A pamphlet titled, "What is the Third Estate?" So here's some excerpts. Quote, "What is necessary? That a nation should subsist and prosper? Individual effort and public functions. All individual efforts may be included in 4 classes. First, since the earth and the waters furnish crude products for the needs of man, the first class and logical sequence will be that of all families which devote themselves to agricultural labor. Between the first sale of products and their consumption or use, a new manipulation, more or less repeated, adds to these products a second value. In this manner, human industry succeeds in perfecting the gifts of nature, and the crude product increases 2-fold, 10-fold, 100-fold in value. Such are the efforts of the second class. Between production and consumption, as well as between the various stages of production, a group of intermediate agents establish themselves, useful both to producers and consumers. These are the merchants and the brokers, who, comparing incessantly the demands of time and place, speculate upon the profit of retention and transportation. Merchants, who are charged with distribution, in the last analysis, either at wholesale or at retail. This species of utility characterizes the third class. Outside of these 3 classes of productive and useful citizens who are occupied with real objects of consumption and use, there is also need in a society of a series of efforts and pains whose objects are directly useful and agreeable to the individual. This 4th class embraces all those who stand between the most distinguished and liberal professions and the less esteemed services of the domestics. Such are the efforts which sustain society. Who puts them forth? The third estate. Public functions may be classified equally well, in the present state of affairs, under 4 recognized heads: the sword, the robe, the church, and the administration. It would be superfluous to take them up one by one for the purpose of showing that everywhere the third estate, meaning the commoners, attends to 19/20ths of them, with this distinction, that it is laden with all that which is really painful, with all the burdens which the privileged classes refuse to carry. Do we give the third estate credit for this? This might come about, it would be necessary that the third estate should refuse to fill these places, or that it should be less ready to exercise their functions. The facts are well known. Meanwhile, they have dared to impose a prohibition upon the order of the third estate. They have said to it, whatever may be your services, whatever may be your abilities, you shall go thus far, you may not pass beyond. Certain rare exceptions, properly regarded, are but a mockery, and the terms which are indulged in on such occasions, one insults all the more. All right, I'll interrupt here to say, so what he's, for example, under the old order, the ancien regime, as they would say, the monarchy, pre-revolutionary monarchy, to be a governor, to be a senior officer in the military, colonel and above, or command or in the Navy, commander and above, captain and above. one had to prove aristocratic lineage. Otherwise, you can only go so far. Like to be the the governor of one of their colonies or governor of one of their provinces. You had to be an aristocrat. A commoner, person of common birth, no matter how well educated, simply could never get the title. So that's what he's talking about. So back to the text. If this exclusion is a social crime against the third estate, if it is a veritable act of hostility, could it perhaps be said that it is useful to the public weal? Alas, who is ignorant of the effects of monopoly? If it discourages those whom it rejects, is it not well known that it tends to render less able those whom it favors? Is it not understood that every employment from which free competition is removed becomes more expensive and less effective? And setting aside any function whatsoever to serve as an appanage for a distinct class among citizens, is it not to be observed that it is no longer the man alone who does the work that is necessary to reward, but all the unemployed members of the same caste, and also the entire families of those who are employed, as well as those who are not? It is not to be remarked that since the government has become the patrimony of a particular class, it has been distended beyond all measure. Places have been created not on account of the necessities of the governed, but in the interest of the governing. Has not attention been called to the fact that this order of things, which is basely, and I even presume to say, beastly, respectable with us, when we find it in the reading of the history of ancient Egypt or the accounts of voyages to the Indies, is despicable, monstrous, destructive of all industry, the energy of social progress, above all, degrading to the human race in general, and particularly intolerable to Europeans. But I must leave these considerations, which, if they increase the importance of the subject and throw light upon it, perhaps, along with the new light, slacken our progress. It suffices here to have made it clear that the pretended utility of a privileged order for the public service is nothing more than a chimera, that with it all, that which is burdensome in this service is performed by the third estate, that without it the superior places would be infinitely better filled, that they naturally ought to be the lot and recompense of ability and recognized services, and that if privileged persons have come to usurp all the lucrative and honorable posts, it is a hateful injustice to the rank and file of citizens, and at the same time a treason to the public. Who then shall dare to say that the third estate has not within itself all that is necessary for the formation of a complete nation? It is the strong and robust man who has one arm still shackled. If the privileged order should be abolished, considering what's going to happen, that's If the privileged order should be abolished, the nation would be nothing less but something more. Therefore, what is the third estate? Everything, but in everything shackled and oppressed. What would the third estate be without the privileged order? Everything, but in everything free and flourishing. Nothing can succeed without it. Everything would be infinitely better without the others. It is not sufficient to show that privileged persons, far from being useful to the nation, cannot but enfeeble and injure it. It is necessary to prove further that the noble order does not enter at all into the social organization, that it may indeed be a burden upon the nation, but that it cannot of itself constitute a nation. In the first place, it is not possible, in the number of all the elementary parts of a nation, to find a place for the caste of nobles. I know that there are individuals in great number whom infirmities, incapacities, incurable laziness, or the weight of bad habits render strangers to the labors of society. The exception and the abuse are everywhere found beside the rule. But it will be admitted that the less there are of these abuses, the better it will be for the state. The worst possible arrangement of all would be where not alone isolated individuals, but a whole class of citizens should take pride in remaining motionless in the midst of general movement, and should consume the best part of the product without bearing any part in its production. Such a class is surely estranged to the nation by its indolence. The noble order is not less estranged from the generality of us by its civil and political prerogatives. What is a nation? A body of associates living under a common law, represented by the same legislature. Is it not evident that the noble order has privileges and expenditures which it dares to call its rights, but which are apart from the rights of the great body of citizens? It departs there from common law. So its civil rights make of it an isolated people in the midst of a great nation. This is truly imperium in imperia. In regard to its political rights, these also it exercises apart. It has its special representatives, which are not charged with securing the interest of the people. The body of its deputies sit apart, and when it is assembled in the same hall with the deputies of simple citizens, it is none the less true that its representation is essentially distinct and separate. It is a stranger to the nation, in the first place by its origin, since its commission is not derived from the people; then by its object, which consists of defending not the general, but the particular interest. The third estate embraces then all that which belongs to the nation, and all that which is not the third estate cannot be regarded as being of the nation. What is the third estate? It is the whole. Okay, so some of this should seem familiar. These themes are going to recur in subsequent revolutions and all subsequent protest movements. It's the same kind of theme. So there's nothing just happens. Nothing just happens. There's nothing new. Kohelet said this in the book in the Bible. There's nothing new under the sun. All this has happened before. It only seems new because no one studies history. All right, and there's a lot of foreboding here, considering what's going to happen. Like the third estate, like the first estate, the aristocrats, they're not even part of the nation. They're just parasites, and the nation would be fine without them. And in fact, better without them. So, the guillotine, the mass executions, that did not just happen. But this, just reading it is just an abstraction. It sounds just like somebody complaining without understanding the context. All the tax theft, all that we covered in the previous session, as well as this corvée, this forced labor, which of course the aristocrats could buy their way out of, but most of the third estate could not. Okay, this pamphlet became a national bestseller, and the thesis of the pamphlet became a rallying point. He put language to sentiments that many others in the third estate were feeling, especially with the unpaid forced labor thing. And so they had a rallying point. So people all read this before, in the period after it had been announced that the Estates General was going to meet, but before it actually met. So people were primed, and it gave them a common language when they first met to talk about, their complaints. And, there's no doubt many of those complaints were legitimate. Now, there's also no doubt the revolution went too far, with the mass murders, but, they at its core, there were legitimate, there were problems, with feudalism and with the old order. Okay, now this guy's a priest still, of course, not fulfilling his duties, but, he's a priest. As a cleric, Saillet was technically a member of the first estate, the first house, but he so despised his own means of support. He's still parasiting off the church, but he so despised it that he served as one of the 20 deputies to the third estate, to the third house, representing the city of Paris, where he was living, even though he should be living in Brittany because that's where his benefice was, that's where the abbey was, that was supporting him. But so this guy is a dirtbag now. However, you read he wrote very well, very persuasively to people who were already frustrated, had the same sentiments, but did not have his language skills. So, he did have significance. And he remained a political figure throughout the early revolution and later into the Napoleonic period. And he managed to die of natural causes, instead of getting guillotined, which, many of these guys that we're going to cover ended up getting guillotined. His rhetoric in this pamphlet provided a common focus for the delegates representing the third estate, such that when like before reading this, all the delegates of the third estate would have had common demands for food and reduction of tax theft. But with after reading this and talking about it among themselves, in the months preceding the estates, when they arrived, in addition to demands for food and reduction of tax theft, they would also demand what would now be referred to as systemic change in the distribution of power and status in the realm. January 24th, 1789, King Louis XVI officially opened elections for delegates to the Estates General. April 27th, 1789, another set of riots broke out in Paris by workers in a wallpaper factory in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Since they were in Paris, it was easier, to control, I shouldn't say that. It was easy to identify who was not showing up to work. And and the owners of the wallpaper factory, invoking the corvée, which was the forced labor, had thugs go and round up some of the workers to force them to work without pay, because they would make the wallpaper and then export it. So that was a way, nobody domestically had money to buy it, but if they sold it foreign, and French interior design in the 18th century was it was a high profit luxury good, a luxury product for those who could afford it. But shockingly, these wallpaper workers in this factory did not want to work without being paid, so they resisted. hence the riot. 25 workers were killed in battles with the police. The next month, May 4th, so that's the second blood. The Day of the Tiles in Grenoble, and now the riots at the Réveillon wallpaper factory. The second blood drawn in the Revolution. The next month, May 4th, 1789, the Estates General officially open at Versailles, the Royal Palace at Versailles. Now Versailles is also a town, so the toponymy. It originally was a hunting lodge that Louis XIV expanded into a huge, very huge palace for himself. But it was also the town. It's about 50 miles outside of Paris. So the Estates General met there. The immediate problem was that of voting. At the previous meeting of the Estates General in 1614, of course, no one was alive, to remember that, any of the procedures, but there were some records. And records indicated that voting at that previous meeting had been by estate, meaning that for any issue there were only 3 votes cast. Each estate just cast 1 vote. Now, as we've seen, since the medieval course, the church hierarchy, because of the feudalism problem, was dominated by younger sons of aristocratic families, meaning as clergy, they were in the first estate. And as younger sons of aristocracy, they would get the best position, so they were the leaders of the first estate. The second estate was the nobility. So they were not only of the same class, but were literally related to each other. The leaders of the first estate and second estate were literally related to each other. So, like a count or a duke, he is a member of the second estate. But his third son might be the Archbishop of Paris, who's in the first estate. Therefore, in a 3-vote system, the first and second estates could always combine to outvote the third, the commoners, and vote to grant themselves privileges and exemptions denied to the commoners, such as exemption from tax theft. Sieyès' pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, had a decisive influence on the delegates from the Third Estate to this first Estates General in 175 years, in demanding that the number of the demand a change in the voting procedure. There were a few different options presented, but they certainly did not want to keep the 3-vote system. So initially, the reform demanded was that the number of deputies for their order be equal to that of the 2 privileged orders combined. So they weren't stipulating a specific number for either, just that whatever it turned out to be, like whatever number of votes the first and second estate had together, that they would have an equal number. And most controversially, they were demanding that the Estates General vote not by orders, but by heads, by the actual numbers. By addressing the issue of representation directly, Sieyès inspired resentment and agitation that united the Third Estate against all feudal traditions, the privileges of hereditary monarchy, hereditary aristocracy, and the effect that had on the church, because that was the church hierarchy. So again, the church gets blamed for this, even though the feudalism was not our fault, but we get blamed for it. So to put some numbers to this, in 1789, the first estate, the clergy, consisted of 100,000 men, 134 of whom were bishops. The second estate, the nobility, consisted of 400,000. The third estate, the commoners, consisted of all the rest of the 25.5 million people in France. Of those, 21 million worked in agriculture or some form of, either growing crops or breeding animal herds or fishing, but, food production, basically. Yeah. In 1789, the Third Estate, primed proximately by Sayé's pamphlet, but also by at least the professional class, the literate class, who were members of the Third Estate, the lawyers, the doctors, bureaucrats, teachers, they were commoners. So, even though some, if they might be financially merchants, they might be financially successful, but they were still commoners. So, they were excluded. There was a, ceiling, so to speak, a class ceiling. So that they had been primed by generations of Enlightenment writing about democratic ideology. And they had the example of the American Revolution. And remember, France allied with us against the British during the American Revolution. And so they saw what happened there with that revolution. There was a war, of course, against England, and it was bloody. It was more bloody than we tend to remember in our history. But that war, it went on for 7 years. The American Revolution, the fight against the British, went on for 7 years. But by this point, in 1789, it was a republic, it had a constitution with a bicameral legislature, an elected president. So it worked. They look and see, okay, it was possible. It was so that they had a working model of something to look at, to compare unfavorably, of course, with their own situation. But what triggered all this was the collapsing economy, which was, triggered by the tax theft, among other things. So taxation was the initial issue. Because the first two estates could always combine against the Third Estate in matters of taxation to pass taxes and then exempt themselves from paying it. Even though the Third Estate made up the vast, overwhelming percentage of the population, a few other salient points have to be remembered. The Third Estate, in terms of the aggregate of the nation, consisted for the most part of food producers who were not interested in politics. Because many were not literate, and even those who might have had basic literacy, they just didn't have the time. I mean, that's a hard way to make a living. As a farmer, a fisherman, raising animals. I mean, that's sun up to sundown, and then at sundown, after doing that kind of work all day, most don't have the energy to light candles and read political pamphlets, so they just fall asleep. However, it was in the cities like Paris and Rouen, Marseille, where there were educated and financially successful men who had leisure time and who felt entitled to a role in government, to which they were, under the old order, perpetually excluded because of the governing principle of hereditary aristocratic government. The First Estate, the clergy, was open to anyone. But in practice, as we've seen, it had become internally stratified by class, such that the parish clergy were made up of commoners, while the bishops and abbots, archbishops, cardinals, all those positions were held by younger sons of aristocratic families. Since the Gallican monarchs had never allowed the Council of Trent to be properly implemented in France, many of these high prelates did not reside in their benefices, but collected the income to support themselves, while in some cases they might have continued to live among their aristocratic relatives in one of the family palaces or chateaux. Or they might use the money. They might, just get an apartment in Paris and live there. Or depending on the size of the benefice or how many they had, because some could collect more than one, maybe get their own chateau or have two places, have a country chateau and an apartment in the city. And this enraged the commoners of the laity who were neglected sacramentally, even though they had to pay the tithes to support the church. as well as enraged the parish clergy themselves, who were paid a minute amount of money, and they to the extent that any sacramental work was done, they're the ones who did it. So the guy who, if it's a big parish, say in the city of Paris, the guy who was pastor, might be absentee, because he might be the younger son of a wealthy family who just bought that for him. Whereas if it was big enough that, if there was a priest there doing the work, it would be a commoner who was just paid a regular salary. He didn't get the benefits. So again, putting some numbers to this. On average, in 1789, a bishop in France was paid 100,000 francs a year. A pastor of a parish was paid 700 francs a year. All other priests working in parishes who were not pastors and who did not have a benefice were just paid 300 francs a year, as compared to the bishops making 100,000 francs a year. Now, we focused on the damage inflicted on the church by the Enlightenment, by rationalism, but it also eroded the secular order as well, the secular hierarchy, the royalty and aristocracy. On the surface, the 18th century was a time of unrivaled power for secular monarchs, who were able to assert an ideology of absolutism based on a political theology of divine right of kings. Yet, the anti-clerical and anti-religious intellectual trends of the Enlightenment came to foster resentment of the claims to authority of royalty, aristocracy, and church hierarchy. All of them, seeing them all as of a piece. To the mind of educated, yet disenfranchised lawyers, doctors, journalists, civil servants, and parish clergy, the upper classes would keep them in perpetual servitude to parasite off of, to sustain their own lifestyle. Okay, so back to the chronology. May 6th, 1789, the deputies, that's what they call, like our representative, that's what they called them, the deputies of the Third Estate, on that date refused to meet separately from the other estates. So they occupied the main hall, and they invited the clergy and the nobility, the first two estates, to join them. Not to be separate estates, but actually to just, like Saillet, primed by Saillet, that say the Third Estate is the one that does everything. So if you want to be part of the nation, then join us. Don't keep yourself separate as parasites. Now, of course, they didn't agree at first. We'll see what's going to happen. June 3rd, 1789, a scientist named Jean-Sylvain Bailly, Bailly, was elected as leader of the Third Estate deputies. He was a son of the professional class, like the Abbé Saillet, rather than a member of the nobility. He was trained as a mathematician. By this point, he was already a published astronomer, and his name was known, at least in scientific circles. He became interested in politics for similar reasons as Saillet, because men of his class, despite their education and the crushing burden of tax theft that they had to submit to, had no role in government. Now, political parties, as understood in the United States, were not legal at the time under the monarchy. But through Bailly, we can see the nucleus of how an analog developed in this French context, an analog to political parties. They started as clubs, so political parties were not legal under the monarchy, but clubs were, just like associations, just, clubs. Guys get together, a dinner club, a reading club, book club. As obviously in this context, the ones that are going to matter are political clubs. But there's sometimes, like, you might have a club that officially was a book club, was a reading club, but it was actually a political club. So Bailly was a member of the Breton Club, Breton, which refers to the province of Brittany. Okay. I got this larger so I can see. Okay. Okay, so this is France, and you see Brittany. It's a peninsula jutting out into the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean. It is south of Normandy, so where the D-Day happened, that was further. Normandy is here. Normandy's here, and Brittany is here. So the Breton Club. The benefice supporting the parasite Saillet was actually in Brittany. So he became interested in the political activities of the Breton Club, far more interested than he ever had been in serving his benefice. In this way, Saillet met Bailly and other like-minded educated men of the professional class. And even though technically, remember, Saillet is actually a member of the First Estate. He's clergy, and these guys are members of the Third Estate. But they share many political commonalities. In the lead-up to the 1789 meeting of the Estates General, the 200 members of the Breton Club, that's what they had at the time, the club met at the Café Amaury in the town of Versailles to plan strategy. In the early stages of the Revolution, they were known as moderates, favoring a constitution that would legally ensure equality for all, either through a legally limited monarchy, a constitutional monarchy like England, or a republic like the United States. For this reason, they were known as the Society of Friends of the Constitution. Now, there was no constitution yet in France. So initially these are people who wanted a constitution. That was their first solution to the problem. When events to be described shortly caused the move of the revolutionary legislature to Paris in October of '89, this Breton Club rented for their meetings the refectory of the monastery, of a monastery. Well, not, it should be called a priory, but if you read about it, they're going to call it a monastery, but technically it should be a priory. Dominican priory on the street Saint Honoré, which the location was convenient because it was next to, within walking distance of where the assembly was meeting at that time. This was referred to as the Monastery of the Jacobins, Jacobins. Referred to in this context to Dominicans, French Dominicans, because remember from the medieval course, the first Dominican priory in the city of Paris was on the Rue Saint-Jacques, the St. James Street. And they kept the name, the nickname, even after they moved to a different street. So in this way, the term Jacobin or Jacobin in French history refers to revolutionaries. Now, as we'll see, rifts developed within this group between, the moderates, very, conservative moderates who wanted a constitutional monarchy, to just moderates who wanted a constitutional republic, no monarchy, to those who, more radical, until you get to the extreme, the homicidal maniacs. June 4th, 1789, the Dauphin, which was the French equivalent to the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent, died. He of tuberculosis. It was a lung thing. He was only 7 years old, and so it's a personal tragedy for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So he was followed as Dauphin by his younger brother, also named Louis. And as we'll see, he because of the revolution, he was never crowned, and he died, through mistreatment while still a child. So he would have been Louis the 17th. June 10th. At the suggestion of Saillet, the Third Estate deputies decided to hold their own meeting and invite the other estates to join them, as I said. So, June 17th. On the proposal of Saillet, the deputies of the Third Estate went farther and declared themselves distinct. They declared themselves the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly, with the purpose of writing a constitution for France, like the Constitution in the United States. And it's confusing reading about this period because I got to. Among the many mistakes that were made in this period, they're eventually going to not in this minute, but they're going to impose term limits, a one term limit, so that if you serve one term, then you could not serve again in the same position. So every legislature, when it finished its session, and then the next one would be a completely new body of people. And so in Histories of the Revolution, and they kept giving themselves different names instead of just, we're the Congress, or we're the Parliament, or we're the Third Estate. So you have the National Assembly, the National Constituent Assembly, the National Convention, the Legislative Assembly. It's all the same. It's the revolutionary. It's the legislature during the revolutionary period, but they kept changing their names. So at this point, it's the National Assembly. On June 19th, by a vote of 149 in favor, against versus 137 against, the deputies of the First Estate, the clergy, voted to dissolve as the First Estate and join the Third Estate, like Saillet had done. Like he even though he was a member of the First Estate, he attended as a delegate of the Third Estate. So, and they're following his example. All right. It was in the nature of the change that the commoners of the clergy and the commoners among the laity had some superficial commonality in terms of their desire for change. But digging deeper, when you eventually, if you dig deep enough, then the objectives will diverge. The commoners among the clergy, the parish priest, simply wanted a fair distribution of resources, opportunities for advancement, and work. They completely agreed, however, with the bishops, with the hierarchy, in their Gallican ecclesiology, the national church ecclesiology, that the Pope would just be a spiritual figurehead for the Catholic Church, but would have no actual jurisdiction in France over the French Church. But they differed from the bishops in the notion of internal church governance. The commoners among the laity, however, had an entirely different agenda. They wanted to strip both the nobility and the clergy of the privileged status that both had enjoyed since the medieval period. Specifically, they wanted the property, the large estates owned by the aristocracy and the church, to be available for purchase by the laity. They wanted the big estates, carved up into smaller plots of land that anyone could buy. They wanted they wanted the state, not the church, to control education. They wanted to distribute to themselves the vast wealth and valuable items collected by the church over the centuries. They wanted an elected legislature to have control over tax theft. They wanted commissions in the Army and Navy, the highest ranking, the senior officer commissions, to be open to all based on merit, not based on proof of hereditary nobility. They wanted government, not only nationally but locally, to be elected, and therefore accountable to the people in the area. So accountable meaning that they would have a term, and if the guy did well, you could reelect him. If he didn't, then you elect somebody else. Again, they're looking at the American, the new, which was new, but still, I'd been around long enough for them to see, for them to think that this is not just a fantasy, that this had actually happened and was functioning somewhere else, among an ally at the time. So the laity of the Third Estate used gullible clergy to help bring down the nobility, and then turned against the clergy. Once the essential alliance that had existed since the Middle Ages of throne and altar, as they would say, of church and state, once that alliance had been disrupted, that was divide and conquer. So the way was open for more radical atheists and political revolutionaries to seize control of the government, and that's how it turned homicidal. On June 20th, 1789, Louis XVI did not like the way this was going. He was not looking for systemic change. His economy was broken. He needed to have it fixed. And, he was advised by Brienne, who was now no longer in office, and others, not just Brienne, but advised that this was the way, because of the non-compliance, the passive resistance, so to speak. There's only so many, and no way to really pay all that. Anyway, you understand what. But Louis didn't like this whole talk of Constitution, because that would mean limiting his power, and therefore would mean that he would pass on to his heir a lessened, diminished monarchy, which he didn't want. So he ordered the meeting hall of the Third Estate, where they were meeting, closed and locked. So, but the deputies, they were still going to meet. So instead, they gathered in an indoor tennis court in Versailles, and in the tennis court, they swore an oath that they would not separate as the Third Estate until they had given France a constitution. So it's called in French history the tennis court oath, which reads in part, quote, "We swear never to separate ourselves from the National Assembly, and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the Constitution of the realm is drawn up and fixed upon solid foundations." 20th of June, 1789. 2 days later, they met. As obviously, once the king realized, then the tennis court was in Versailles, so he was able to restrict access. So, okay, they just met somewhere else. They met in a church, Church of Saint Louis in Versailles, in the town of Versailles. It's still there, but it's a museum now. 150, and on the June 22nd meeting, 150 deputies from the clergy, there weren't 150 clerics, in other words, joined them, along with 2 from the nobility. The following day, June 23rd, Louis XVI personally addressed the full Estates General, where he declared invalid by royal edict all the actions thus far of the aggregation referring to itself as the National Assembly. And he commanded the 3 estates to continue to meet, but to meet as three estates. So they would meet in separate locations, discuss the same issue at the same time, and then each produce a vote. So command them to go back to the previous three votes per issue. So he gave these orders, and then, okay, it's done. Then he just left. And almost every single one of the second estate, the aristocrats left with him, and many, not all, but many of the first estate. But the third estate deputies remained in the hall. When the king's master of ceremonies reminded them that Louis had invalidated their actions, making themselves the National Assembly, that was no longer valid, and that since the first two estates were no longer assembled, were no longer in session, that they also could no longer be in session, so they should go home. A guy, he's best known by his title, the Count, the Comte de Mirabeau, Mirabeau. So he was an aristocrat by birth, but he was one, like Saillet was a priest who hated the priesthood. Mirabeau was an aristocrat who hated the aristocracy. And like Saillet, he did not attend the Estates General with his own estate, with the second estate, the nobility. Instead, he got himself elected as a deputy representing town, Aix-la-Chapelle, AIX, with Aachen from the medieval period, as a third estate deputy. So after the master of ceremonies announced this, okay, we're no longer in session, then he shouted, "We are assembled here by the will of the people, and we would only leave at the point of a bayonet." And he was a moderate. He was one of those that initially he favored a constitutional monarchy. So he was not, but he gets pushed by things like this. June 25th, another four. Previously, we had two members of the aristocracy join the third estate. On June 25th, another 48 joined, bringing it up to 50. June 27th, Louis XVI, after investigating, talking to his army commanders, and being, given the very disconcerting news that, well, since His Majesty has not paid his army, that we cannot guarantee their loyalty. We cannot guarantee that if we tell them to fix bayonets and go, forcibly disperse these people, we can't guarantee that they'll do it. That they'll do that instead of fixing their bayonets and sticking them in us. So June 27th, Louis XVI reversed course, and he instructed. He pretended that this was his will now. He instructed the nobility and the clergy to meet with the third estate, and he essentially recognized the National Assembly. So he backed down publicly. A public humiliation, a public display of weakness. At the same time, since he could not rely on his own army, he ordered units he considered more reliable, composed of Swiss and German mercenaries, to come to Paris. July 6th, 1789. The National Assembly formed a committee of 30 members to write a constitution. July 8th, the Count de Mirabeau, who we just met, demanded that the Garde Français, the French guards, of the military household of France be moved out of the city of Paris. Because, he didn't realize that they were no longer loyal to the king. The third estate was afraid that the king was going to take him up on his boast, will only disperse at the point of a bayonet. So the French guards were a unit. It was a regiment. It was a regiment in the French army, considered an elite unit. The kind of unit that, in other circumstances, like a Praetorian Guard, that that a leader would use in a case like this to preserve his power. So Mirabeau had moved, and the National Assembly voted to approve on July 8th the demand that the French Guard be moved out of Paris. and that to ensure public order, a new civil guard be created within the city. On July 9th, the National Assembly renamed itself the National Constituent Assembly. So this is one of, there are like half a dozen names they gave themselves, which confuses things, but it's all the Revolutionary Assembly. July 11th, the third now, the outburst of violence in which lives were lost. Roving mobs in Paris were active. And they burned the hated customs barriers where the tolls and fees had been stolen. As part of the tax theft that I summarized in the last session. In this fight, in this June 11th, remember Louis had summoned Swiss and German mercenaries. So his German guard, the Regiment de Royal Allemand, the German guard, were loyal for the moment, were loyal to the king. So they attacked the mob as the mob that burned the customs barriers. And lives were lost. So this is now the fourth episode of the loss of life. The following day, July 12th, they engaged in a street battle with members of the French Guard. So these are just two different regiments in the king's army. The French Guard and the German Guard. So the German Guard at this point were ironically loyal to the French king, but the French Guard were not. And the French Guard sided with the Paris mob that the previous day tore down the customs barriers, the tax collection post. And so they engaged in street fighting. So it was not just a mob against soldiers. This was soldiers against soldiers. But on one side were soldiers and a mob against other soldiers. So many in the city who didn't really know, I mean, a lot of this was spontaneous, and you just look out your window, then all of a sudden, the people are shooting at each other. So many in the city assumed that this was a prelude to the king using the regular army to force them to accept Cardinal Brienne's corvée plan, the mandatory unpaid labor. Even though Brienne was no longer a finance minister. Now, he was still a cardinal, he was still Archbishop of Sens, but he was no longer in that position. So, but people were still, this was the fear. The next day, July 13th, the National Assembly declared itself in permanent session at the Hôtel de Ville, with the City Hall in Paris. City leaders, as distinct from the National Assembly, Paris as a municipality also had a municipal government, and that's who these people were. So the municipal government in Paris, began to form its own governing committee to create a militia, to create a city militia, because these are people who lived in Paris. I mean, they didn't want their city destroyed. There's a lot of these people, the French Guard, the German Guard. Some of these delegates from the Third Estate coming from other parts of Paris, if they get in a fight and burn down part of the city, then they're just going to go home. Whereas the people, the Parisians live there, so they wanted to form their own militia to protect their city. The members of the French Guard, who participated in the July 12th battle on the side of the mob, were technically traitors, and under the law, they fought against their king. So they were liable to the death penalty if they had been captured. So they began collecting weapons and remembered that the Bastille, which a fortress, was also, among its other functions, had a warehouse and an armory, which had 250 barrels of gunpowder with which to arm the weapons. So the French Guard, it's estimated that they attacked an armory, and they got about 30,000 muskets, but they needed powder and shot, and so that was kept in the Bastille. So this is the background for the first famous event in the French Revolution, but it was actually the fifth? I think we're the fifth conflict in which lives were lost, but it's the most famous. July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. All right, so the Bastille Saint Antoine, Bastille, Saint and Antoine, Antoine. So the fortress of St. Anthony. It was constructed during the 100 Years' War in 1357 to defend one of the gateways to Paris, the gate of St. Anthony Gate, the Porte Saint Antoine. Beginning in 1417, it was also used as a political prison for the monarchy to confine those who had offended the king in some way. So this wasn't the only one, but this is one that was in Paris. So everyone who was in one of these royal prisons, one of these political prisons, was actually innocent of any real crime. So if they had been guilty of a crime, then they would have gone through the regular system, and either have been had some kind of mutilation or corporal punishment, flogging, branding, had an ear cut off or something, or they would have been sent to the galleys, for either a term or for life. So everyone knew that everyone in one of these royal prisons was actually not a criminal, just by the fact that they were there. It was a political, well, they weren't all political, but somehow they had offended the king, like the Marquis de Sade, for example, if you know who he is. He had actually served time in the Bastille. Now, what he was doing at the time, he hadn't broken any actual laws, but it offended the sensibilities of many in the aristocracy and of the deeply religious king and queen. So he was punished, with some time in the Bastille. And he actually had only been released 10 days before, coincidentally, 10 days before the storming of the Bastille. Okay, so July 14th, 25 days after the lower clergy of the First Estate joined the Third Estate, a Paris mob from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the neighborhood, St. Anthony neighborhood, stormed the Bastille. The Bastille's governor, the commandant, was Bernard-René Delaunay, Launay. He had 20 cannons and obviously had plenty of powder, so they put up a fight. But they were caught off guard, so they did not have food and water for a protracted siege. Otherwise, history would have been very different, because, a mob certainly could not have taken the Bastille. It was a fortress. But Delaunay, he just didn't plan right. He did not have any stockpiled supplies. 5,000 regular troops were bivouacked on the Champ de Mars, on a field, within sight. They could actually see and hear what was going on. But they chose to remain in place rather than side. Now, later, the officers, the senior officers, who were aristocrats, and one would think that just out of self-interest they would side with the king, but they realized that their men were not reliable, so they were afraid, to command them to go and disperse the mob, because especially after seeing the French Guard, many of the French Guard having turned and joined the mob, they were afraid to send 5,000 armed men into Paris with orders like that, because they might turn and join the mob themselves. So they just stayed in camp and were not involved. And when Delaunay realized that, he surrendered, because they were going to die of thirst. He opened the gates. He was mauled to death, along with Jacques de Flesselles, Flesses, Elles. Flesselles was his title was the provost of the Merchants Guild, but functionally, prior to this, that position was the de facto mayor of Paris, of the municipality of Paris. Both of their heads were removed. They were mauled to death, and then posthumously their heads were removed and put on sticks and paraded around to celebrate the triumph. 98 attackers, and one defender died in the actual fighting. After the surrender, 3 officers, 2 enlisted men of the Bastille garrison were lynched, along with Delaunay and Flessel, who were mauled to death. So, let's see. So 107 casualties. In 1790, I'll say the guy who we're going to meet, the Marquis de Lafayette, who, France was allied with the United States against England in the American Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette was a French officer who served in the, with us against the English, and he went back to France and was involved in the French Revolution. In 1790, he gave an iron key from the Bastille to the U.S. President George Washington, whom he had known and served with previously during the Revolution. Washington displayed it prominently at different events, public events, and then when he retired, brought it back to his residence at Mount Vernon, and it's still there. It's on display at Mount Vernon. The Bastille itself was torn down. The footprint is outlined in brick on the location where it once stood. And there's a plaque there, too. Now, as we say, the Bastille was not the first occasion of violence in the Revolution. But the capture of the Bastille merits its fame. That's often pointed to as the date when the Revolution began. But it merits its turning point owing to the conscious inaction of the regular army, of the officers of the regular army, and for the reason specifically that, remember, unpaid. Remember, nobody's been paid because the economy's collapsed. So even those aristocratic officers who would have personally preferred to fight for the king, or because that meant fighting to preserve their own class, they couldn't trust their men because the men hadn't been paid. Yeah, cause and effect. As well as the act of treason, and that members of the French Guard, who were part of the French army, an elite regiment, joined the mob in attacking a royal fortress. So actively fought, consciously, deliberately, not just caught up in the moment. Deliberately planned and joined an attack against the king in his fortress. The king was not in the fortress, but you know what I mean. Attacking the king by attacking his fortress. The following day, July 15th, since the provost of the Merchants Guild was murdered, and he was functionally the mayor, Paris needed some kind of executive officer. So Bailly, whom we've already met, Bailly, was elected and given the new title. They created the title Mayor of Paris, and he was elected to that position. He was elected by the National Assembly, which was now clearly a revolutionary assembly. The Marquis de Lafayette, who we've seen, he was appointed commander of a newly formed Garde Nationale, or National Guard, meaning so the revolutionary legislature is starting to assemble its own army. Like Mirabeau, the Count de Mirabeau, the Marquis de Lafayette was born an aristocrat, and he opposed the absolutism of the old order, but not necessarily monarchy itself for France. Even he fought for us, fought with us against England, and he admired our republic and our constitution, but he was not opposed to monarchy itself for France. So he would have preferred, his preferred solution was a constitutional monarchy, ironically like England, even though, that was the enemy. But he liked that idea of having the stability of a hereditary monarch, as head of state, but an elected legislature that could be removed by the voters as responsible for the government, for the actual government. Now, while all this is going on, Louis XVI was, completely befuddled. He assumed that the fall of the Bastille was the work of an isolated, crazed mob combined with a cowardly governor. He allowed himself to be persuaded by idealists like Mirabeau and Lafayette that moderate reforms would save the monarchy by giving the bulk of the population a reason to sacrifice to save the French economy and therefore restore stability to the social order. At the same time, in the other ear, his queen, Marie Antoinette, demanded that he crush the malcontents and not surrender a single royal prerogative, to hand on to her son. That when her son, when her son became king, she wanted him to have the fullness of absolute, monarchy that Louis had inherited from his predecessor. Now, Louis's temperament was of the sort that he was persuaded by the last person he spoke to, but never to the point of taking action. He was a procrastinator. Now, as events developed, in retrospect, the situation was already, beyond the control of any of these factions. July 16th, the new Paris City Council, not the National Assembly, but the City Council in Paris, elected without prior approval of the king, voted to destroy the Bastille. So the City Council votes to destroy a royal fortress without reference to the king. Similar city councils or committees and local militias were forming in other major cities, Lyon and Rennes and Rouen, Marseille, Toulon. So central royal government now is completely collapsed, completely broken down. Remember, they're still all unpaid. The following day, July 17th, the king visited the city of Paris, where he was welcomed at the city hall, the Hôtel de Ville, by Bailly, the new mayor, and Lafayette, the commander of the new National Guard, which again was forming a military unit without reference to the king, without his command, approval, or decision. And at this case, in this meeting, July 17th, Louis wore the tricolor cockade, which is like a knot of ribbons put on a circular thing and put on the hat. So the tricolor, the three colors, were blue, white, and red. All right. So initially, while this was going on, the Hôtel de Ville, the City Hall of Paris, Paris's colors, like the flag of Paris, was blue and red. And so that was the cockade, that the thing that they wore on their hats, like the guys in the municipal government. Well, Lafayette, since he was a monarchist, constitutional, but still a monarchist, he added white, and so that became the blue, white, and red, the tricolor, the tricolor tricolor on his hat, and the white represented the monarchy because the flag, the French flag prior to the Revolution, was white, white background, white flag with a gold fleur-de-lis on it. The fleur-de-lis is a stylized lily, and it's a symbol of the resurrection in Catholic iconography, but was also on the crest of the House de Bourbon, the dynasty of Louis XVI. At this point, Louis's younger brothers had a clearer discernment than Lafayette and Mirabeau. They and many other aristocrats fled, becoming the first wave of realist émigrés to flee the revolution. On July 18th, another of these guys of the professional class, in his case a journalist, his name was Camille Desmoulins, Desmoulin. He began a publication, essentially a series of pamphlets titled Free France, in which he demanded a much more radical revolution, a republic, that constitutional monarchy wasn't enough, that monarchy just had to go. Aristocracy had to go, not be reformed, just go, and replaced with a republic. And argued that violence was justified in accomplishing this objective. July 28th, another of these guys, these professional guys, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, Brissot, began publishing a newspaper, the French Patriot. And this became the newspaper of the Girondins. All right, so here we meet another of the political clubs that were the French analog to political parties. So the Girondins, Girondin, in the singular, and then add an S for the plural. And the members were the Girondists. Originally, these guys were part of the Jacobin movement, those who just wanted change. But they solidified into a subgroup advocating for a republic instead of a constitutional monarchy. The name is derived from the region where the early leaders were born. The Gironde is in southwest France, named after an estuary, the Gironde estuary. It's the famous Bordeaux. Bordeaux, the port city, is on the, in that area, and the Bordeaux wine is actually from the Gironde region. August 4th, 1789, 21 days after the Bastille was stormed, the National Assembly voted to eliminate all feudal privileges of the aristocracy in France, ending the political social structure that had endured for the previous 1,000 years. The lower clergy, as commoners themselves by birth, enthusiastically voted in favor to put the aristocrats in their place, because that included all but one of the 134 French bishops were younger sons of aristocratic families. The only exception was the bishop for the French colonies, who was of non-aristocratic birth, but the other 133 you see the feudalism problem. August 7th, publication of a pamphlet titled "A Plot Uncovered to Lull the People to Sleep." The author, Jean-Paul Marat, Marat, denouncing the reforms of August 4th as insufficient, not far enough, and demanding a much more radical solution. Marat then became the voice, the public voice, and publishing voice of a very turbulent faction of the revolution. So here we meet another, essentially a French analog to a political party, called the Sans-Culottes. So SANS hyphen CULOTTES, Sans-Culottes. So culotte, sans-culotte, sans means without, and the culotte, it literally means breeches, breech, but not underwear. So in English, that refers to underwear, but it refers to the long silk stockings, the knee high silk stockings worn by the aristocracy and those who could afford it. So those without those are the poor, those who could not afford it. So the sans-culottes are essentially the working class. Those who they wore trousers, just wore pants. And as far as shoes, either they had no shoes at all, or they wore some kind of improvised, wooden shoes. Whereas the culotte, the stockings, Hollywood always gets this wrong. Now, if you look at paintings, you'll see these guys. They wore the wigs, the powdered wigs, and then they wore those knee high. Which looked like knee-high socks, but they were silk, so they're very expensive. Now there were no paved roads aside from the some remaining Roman roads. So anyone who traveled faced mud. So what Hollywood always misses is that the way that style developed is those who, like when you rode a horse, you'd wear boots, boots that went up over the knees, like thigh-high boots. And then, if you could afford it, of course. And then when you got to where you were going, your servant, when you walked in the foyer of a house or on the porch, your servant would take those boots off, leave them outside, and then you'd slip on fancy shoes to go into the house. So the culotte still looked white or ivory. I mean, they still look clean, and so you're not walking in the house with the muddy boots. And then when you left, then the servant would do the reverse, take off the slip-on or the buckle shoes, and then put on the boots. But the working class couldn't afford all that, so they just wore pants and were barefoot. So the sans culotte refers to the working class, and they were the most radical faction of the revolution. Marais was another one of these guys. He was not working class by any means. He was another member of the professional class, like Saillet and Bailly. In his case, he was a physician turned political activist for the same reasons as them, just frustration. Originally, he started out as a Jacobin of the Gironde variation, but then he moved. He favored a republic in which people like him could be elected to run the country instead of hereditary aristocrats. But by August of '89, he had become more radical. He concluded that only direct democracy could forever end the abuse of monarchy and nobility, in which so direct democracy means all people would vote on all issues in national referendums instead of through elected legislatures. So the sans culotte, they didn't want either a constitutional monarchy with a parliament or an American-style republic with a bicameral legislature. They just wanted direct democracy. Every issue just put on, like once a month, whatever issues would just be put on the ballot, and people would just go and vote on all of them. So ridiculous, but that's... So this made him a public voice for the working class, even though he was never a member of the working class. August 11th, history changed. Feudalism was abolished in France. The decree abolishing feudalism is dated August 11th, 1789, but the vote, as we saw, took place a few days earlier. So since we've been talking about feudalism for 2 courses now, and it's still endured in other countries, so we're still going to be talking about it. But so here's some excerpts. Article 1, Section 1. The National Assembly hereby completely abolishes the feudal system. It decrees that among the existing rights and dues, all those originating in or representing real or personal serfdom shall be abolished without indemnification. All right, so I'll interject there. So serfdom means, that was a constituent, that was a foundational element of feudalism, is that serfs were legally tied to the land. And if the estate was sold to somebody else, they stayed with the land. Now, without indemnification, so this is free labor, for the landowner. Without indemnification means that no compensation. So the large landowners, who invariably were aristocrats, and the church, have to be, and the church, the large estates, they were not compensated for the loss of the free labor. Article 1, Section 2. The exclusive right to maintain pigeon houses is abolished. Section 3. The exclusive right to hunt and to maintain enclosed warrens is likewise abolished. And everyone shall have the right to kill or to have destroyed on his land all kinds of game. So this is, you remember that if you've seen the Robin Hood, that's England, but and of course it's largely fictional, but there are elements of fact in it, in that despite all the hunger, like you could not go kill a rabbit on the king's land or on the land of an aristocrat. If he owned the land, he decided if he wanted the rabbit killed. And if just some random person, even one of his own serfs, if they killed a rabbit or a deer or whatever on his land without permission, that was a serious punishment. They could be flogged, could have an ear cut off, an eye put out, have a hand chopped off. Now, if it was his own serf, he wouldn't chop the hand off because that would limit the labor he could get, but could do some other mutilations. So it was a serious crime. And that was part of feudalism. That was one of the prerogatives of a feudal lord. So this, eliminating that. Section 4, Article 1, Section 4, all manorial courts are hereby suppressed without indemnification. All right, so this is another privilege, another prerogative of the aristocracy, those who own their own estates. They had their own courts. Where they obviously they picked whoever the judge was, or they acted as judge themselves. Although most didn't do that because that was too much work. So they would appoint someone as a judge, who of course would just rule the way that the Lord wanted. Article 1, Section 5, tithes of every description, as well as those devoted to the maintenance of churches, are abolished. Section 6, all perpetual ground rent, abolishing rent. Article 1, Section 7, the sale of judicial and municipal offices shall be abolished. So that's another element of the feudalism problem. 8, the fees of priests are to be abolished. So these are stipends for, that's how the priests who actually did work but did not have a benefice. That's, one of the ways they, supported that. They survived is, people went for baptisms, weddings, funerals. They would give a stipend or a stole fee, as you would say. Section 9. Taxes. So you see, even with the revolution, they're not giving up tax theft. Taxes shall be collected from all citizens and from all property in the same manner and in the same form, proportionally by all. So they're keeping the tax theft, but they're eliminating all tax exemptions previously enjoyed by the church and the aristocracy, and they're doing today what would be called progressive taxation, indexing it proportion to income. So they wanted to tax the rich, in proportion, tax them more, because they had more income. Section 11, all citizens without distinction of birth are eligible to any office or dignity, whether ecclesiastical, civil, or military, and no profession shall imply any derogation. 12, Section 12, hereafter no remittances shall be made for annates or any other purpose to the court of Rome. So that means Peter's pence was cut off, to Rome, and annates was, I don't know if we got to this. I forget what I said with which class, but annates, anno is the Latin word for year, so annates were imposed by the Vatican for any benefice for a diocese or abbey, not any benefice, but diocese or abbey. The income for the first year, hence anno, annates, the income for the first year had to be paid to Rome. Now, it could be amortized over 5 years, but the amount of 1 year's income had to be sent to Rome. So they're saying, no, we're cutting that out. And Peter's pence is cut out. Skipping down. 19, Article 19. The National Assembly shall consider immediately after the Constitution the drawing up of the laws necessary for the development of the principles which it has laid down in the present decree. August 24th, the Assembly legislates freedom of speech. August 27th, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The Assembly adopted this declaration, obviously analogous to the American Declaration of Independence. The principal drafts were prepared by Lafayette, who participated in the American Revolution, working at times with his close friend Thomas Jefferson, who was in France, because he was they called it the minister, the American minister, but that means ambassador today, ambassador of the United States to France. So he didn't write it, but he Lafayette showed him early drafts. Also, Sayé and Mirabeau also worked on, contributed to the drafts. The last article of the Declaration was adopted on August 26th. So, the Declaration, quote, "The representatives of the people of France formed into a national assembly, considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of human rights are the sole causes of public misfortunes and corruptions of government, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration these natural, imprescriptible, and inalienable rights, that this declaration, being constantly present to the minds of the members of the body social, they may be forever kept attentive to their rights and their duties, that the acts of the legislative and executive powers of government, being capable of being every moment compared with the end of political institutions, may be more respected, and also that the future claims of the citizens, being directed by simple and incontestable principles, may tend to the maintenance of the Constitution and the general happiness. For these reasons, the National Assembly doth recognize and declare, in the presence of the Supreme Being, and with the hope of his blessing and favor, the following sacred rights of men and of citizens. Right number 1. Men are born and always continue free and equal in respect of their rights. Civil distinctions, therefore, can be founded only on public utility. 2. The end of all political associations is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. And these rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance of oppression. 3. The nation is essentially the source of all sovereignty, nor can any individual or body of men be entitled to any authority which is not expressly derived from it. All right, did you catch that? The nation is the source of sovereignty, not the divine right. So under the monarchy, God was the source of the authority of the monarch. So here, no, it's the nation. 4th, political liberty consists in the power of doing whatever does not injure another. The exercise of the natural rights of every man has no other limit than those which are necessary to secure to every other man the free exercise of the same rights. And these limits are determinable only by the law. All right, again, you catch that? So like in our Declaration of Independence, there was a pro forma reference to a supreme being earlier, but notice that the liberty is not based on the supreme being. It's based on the law. 5th, the law ought to prohibit only actions hurtful to society. What is not prohibited by the law should not be hindered, nor should anyone be compelled to that which the law does not require. 6th, the law is an expression of the will of the community. All citizens have a right to concur, either personally or by their representatives, in its formation. It should be the same to all, whether it protects or punishes, and all being equal in its sight are equally eligible to all honors, places, and employments, according to their different abilities, without any other distinction than that created by their virtues and talents. 7. No man should be accused, arrested, or held in confinement, except in cases determined by the law, and according to the forms which it has prescribed. All who promote, solicit, execute, or cause to be executed arbitrary orders ought to be punished, and every citizen called upon or apprehended by virtue of the law ought immediately to obey, and renders himself culpable by resistance. 8. The law ought to impose no other penalties but such as are absolutely and evidently necessary, and no one ought to be punished but in virtue of a law promulgated before the offense and legally applied. 9. Every man, being presumed innocent till he has been convicted, whenever his detention becomes indispensable, all rigor to him, more than is necessary to secure his person, ought to be provided against by the law. 10. No man ought to be molested on account of his opinions, not even on account of his religious opinions, provided his avowal of them does not disturb the public order established by law. 11. The unrestrained communication of thoughts and opinions, being one of the most precious rights of man. Every citizen may speak, write, and publish freely, provided he is responsible for the abuse of this liberty, in cases determined by law. 12. A public force being necessary to give security to the rights of men and of citizens, that force is instituted for the benefit of the community and not for the particular benefit of the persons to whom it is entrusted. 13. A common contribution being necessary for the support of the public force and for defraying the other expenses of government, it ought to be divided equally among the members of the community according to their abilities. Caught that? Tax theft, right? That's working its way. Jefferson left that out of the Declaration of Independence. It eventually made it in, but even in the philosophical statement, they got to put the tax theft in there. 14. Every citizen has a right, either by himself or his representative, to a free voice in determining the necessity of public contributions, the appropriation of them and their account, mode of assessment, and duration. All right, so taxation, but with representation. 15. Every community has had a right to demand of all its agents an account of their conduct. 16. Every community in which a separation of powers and a security of rights is not provided for needs a constitution. 17. The right to property, being inviolable and sacred, except the property of the church, as we'll see. No one ought to be deprived of it, except in cases of public necessity, legally ascertained, and on condition of a previous just indemnity. So this is nationalizing. That's when governments steal private property. Although when they stole the church's property, the church was not indemnified for it. Okay, August 28th. With this, so Lafayette, was one of the drafters of this, and as you've seen, he favored a constitutional monarchy. So, the monarch would exist, and the constitutional monarchy he had in mind was England. And at that period, the English monarch still had some actual governing executive power. unlike today. Over the years, that was more and more eroded. So that's what Lafayette had in mind. So on August 28th, the Assembly debated something, that Mirabeau and Lafayette and the other monarchists proposed, and that is to grant the king the power to veto legislation. So that's an idea Lafayette got, from the American system, where the executive officer, in our case the president, can veto legislation. Doesn't write legislation, but can veto it. So this set off the radicals. 2 days later, August 30th, Camille Desmoulins, who we've already met, organized an uprising in Paris to protest this proposed veto power for the king. It was just street fighting, so nothing happened. It didn't accomplish anything that day, but it was a portend of things to come. August 31st, the Constitution Committee. So the Declaration of the Rights, that was not the Constitution. That was going to be a prelude to it, like our Declaration of Independence. The committee to write the Constitution proposed, again, imitating us, a bicameral parliament, a two-house legislature, and a royal right of veto. Although two-house parliament, it is more the English system, but so both England and the United States have a two-house legislature, but a parliamentary system is different. Sorry about that. September 15th, Desmoulins published a pamphlet, another pamphlet, radical pamphlet, in which he once again argued in favor, arguing that political violence was justified to remove monarchy and aristocracy. September 16th, the first issue of a new newspaper, Jean-Paul Marat's Friend of the People, so a sans-culotte, so another radical, publication. September 19th, election of a new municipal assembly in Paris, 300 members. That was their version of a city council. October 1st, at a banquet in Versailles, in which Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, as well as the Dauphin, Prince Louis, attended. At dessert time, the King's Guard put on the white royal cockade, the white hat, the ribbon on the hat, instead of the tricolor. Now, this was leaked. It was a banquet, so there were people there, servants, everything were there. So it leaked. And it got, rumor. It got, distorted, and so the rumor that spread was false, but had effect that that the guards had actually trampled on the tricolor, well, not the flag yet, but the colors of the revolution. This stoked up emotion, leading to the Women's March on Versailles, October 5th and 6th. The march began in the marketplace of Paris on the morning of October 5th because there was, many of the bakeries were empty, the markets had no bread, and there were some had hoarded bread and that they were charging gouging prices. So there was a riot, a food riot, a bread riot. And the mob grew to thousands. Okay, we're going to go to the king. Now the king was in Versailles. That's a long walk from Paris to Versailles. I mean, today you get there by train. So but they did it. And this spread. It wasn't so the women. It started with women in the market as a food riot, but then expanded and included other. Men obviously got involved too. And they ransacked the city warehouses and marched on Versailles. And the crowd grew to thousands, and it essentially besieged the palace at Versailles. And pressed, they got in the palace. As again, the king didn't have many who were willing to defend him because he wasn't paying them. And so they were, helpless so the mob demanded that the king physically relocate from Versailles to Paris. Said, okay, if you're in Paris, we can watch what food's delivered to you. And so you're going to make sure that we eat too. That's, the underlying dynamic to this. There was a lot of emotion fueling it, but that was the underlying dynamic. And he did. The king, his family, and the assembly, the French assembly, left Versailles and relocated to Paris. So this essentially ended the king's independence. Not officially yet. That's coming, but essentially, if a king gives up to this, he's not king anymore. So that this revealed the new balance of power, and that the revolutionary forces, even the moderates in the assembly, now this is the first time when even they are starting to see, when they realize the old adage of Thomas More, you cannot push a guy off a cliff and tell him to stop halfway down. So they started, they started something that was now out of their control. Let's see. October 10th, the Assembly named Lafayette commander of the regular army units in and around Paris. So he's not commander-in-chief of the whole army, just of the army around Paris. The Assembly also modified, they changed the royal title. So Louis was no longer King of France and Navarre, but King of the French. And a member of the Assembly, a physician named Joseph Ignace Guillotine, proposed a new and more humane form of public execution. He didn't invent it, but because he proposed it and the Assembly adopted it, it was named after him, the guillotine. It was the device to, chop off heads. October 12th, Louis XVI secretly, that's how naive this guy is. He believed that secrets existed. Louis XVI secretly wrote to King Carlos IV of Spain, complaining of his mistreatment, saying that even though he had to publicly, participate in this, he knew it was wrong, and it was only because the troops weren't loyal to him. Meanwhile, one of his younger brothers, the Count d'Artois, who had already gotten out, secretly wrote to the Queen, Marie Antoinette's brother, Joseph II of Austria, requesting military intervention in France. So this is a French aristocrat asking the ruler of Austria, with centuries of antipathy and warfare between them, asking him to invade France. Now, as we'll see, I forget how much detail I'm in, but in case I forget, these letters are going to be leaked, of course, and they're going to be produced as evidence, along with some later letters, against Louis and Marie Antoinette when the revolution put them on trial, so that officially they would be executed for treason instead of just, we hate monarchy. They were really executed because, the people in charge at the time hated monarchy and wanted to do it. But this was the legal basis for it. The National Assembly, which had now moved after the Women's March from Versailles back to Paris, held its first Paris meeting in the chapel of the Archbishop's residence, the Archbishop of Paris, the Notre Dame Chapel, on the Ile de Cité, the island in the Seine River. October 21st, the Assembly declared a state of martial law to prevent future uprisings like the Women's March. November 2nd, 1789. The Assembly voted, sit down for this, to place the property of the church at the disposal of the nation. Right? So this was only 2 months after the clergy from the First Estate deserted the First Estate and joined the Third Estate for the National Assembly. And now they see, now that the lay commoners had used them and now turned on them. The lower clergy who joined them believed that they were allies with the commoners, the lay commoners, when they voted, to strip the aristocracy of its privileges. Well, now, that the deed was done, so now the assembly turns on the church and voted to nationalize all church property in France. So the government just, by this edict, just stole, all church property. Okay. That's a good pause. As it is, this is going to take a long time to upload. So we'll pause here and we'll pick up there now with the church in France, everybody realizing, that the revolution has turned against them. It was not just going to be reform. So we'll pause for now. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.